Washington has just unleashed what it boldly dubs Operation Economic Fury against Iran, but the only genuine devastation currently unfolding is the catastrophic implosion of the American political apparatus from within. When the world's self-proclaimed hegemon exhausts its military bluffs and naval blockades, what is left but a hollow financial bombardment that punishes its own citizens faster than its geopolitical rivals? How long can the global markets and your own vanishing wealth sustain a system where trade policies are hijacked by oligarchs and diplomatic allies are treated as collateral damage in a relentless cycle of extortion? I am Sophia Bennett, and welcome back to Sophia Bennett Reports. Today, we are piercing through the chaotic noise of Capitol Hill to expose a chilling reality. This so-called fury is not a masterstroke of statecraft, but a desperate smokescreen obscuring a crumbling empire, a mutinous alliance, and a systemic grift running straight through the highest offices in the land. Indeed, following the Pentagon's grand displays of military posturing, the United States Treasury has now stepped into the spotlight with its own theatrical production. The stated objective, delivered with the characteristic gravity of Washington's financial architects following their April 16th press briefings, is to unleash a maximalist financial bombardment against Iran. The timing is notably specific, aiming to bleed the Iranian economy dry before the critical April 22nd ceasefire deadline. But for those of us who observe the geopolitical chessboard from a dispassionate, global vantage point, this announcement prompts an immediate, almost bewildering question. Why is the Treasury Department suddenly stepping into the war room? And more importantly, why is the historical sequence of imperial coercion running backwards? Historically, the playbook of a dominant global superpower is remarkably predictable. When faced with a recalcitrant geopolitical competitor, the escalation ladder is climbed with methodical precision. First comes the deployment of economic instruments, such as sanctions, asset freezes, and trade embargoes. If the target remains defiant, the noose tightens with naval blockades and the severing of physical supply lines. Finally, when all else fails, kinetic military force is applied. Yet, what we are witnessing now is a bizarre inversion of this established doctrine. Washington initiated this recent confrontation with a storm of military rhetoric, pivoting to naval blockades when raw posturing failed to break the strategic deadlock in the Strait of Hormuz. Now, having exhausted those dramatic options, they are retreating to the very economic sanctions that were supposed to be the opening move. It is the geopolitical equivalent of a chess grandmaster frantically trying to move their pawns backwards after sacrificing their knights. This strategic regression exposes a profound systemic vulnerability. For years, the United States has maintained an iron grip on the global financial system, utilizing the dollar as a weapon of mass economic restriction. The international community has been told that Iran has been subjected to maximum pressure for over half a decade. So one must logically ask, what exactly is left to sanction? If previous embargoes were truly absolute, this new economic fury is nothing more than striking a match in a vacuum. The reality is that the era of total financial isolation is rapidly closing. Over the past decade, a multipolar financial architecture has quietly taken root. Consider the macroeconomic shift. The United States dollar share of global foreign exchange reserves has plummeted from roughly 72% at the turn of the century to under 59% today, as nations increasingly settle energy trades in their own local currencies, bypassing traditional Western clearinghouses. The efficacy of unilateral financial edicts diminishes exponentially when a system applies maximum pressure continuously. It ceases to be a shock. It becomes the baseline environment to which a nation adapts. The Iranian economy, much like a biological organism subjected to a prolonged, non-lethal toxin, has developed a hardened resilience. The target has mutated, finding alternative shipping lanes, shadow banking networks, and willing buyers in the burgeoning markets of the East. Washington's current maneuvering is less a display of unassailable dominance and more a symptom of strategic exhaustion. The Treasury's announcement is a desperate pantomime. The phantom limb syndrome of an empire that still feels the weight of the absolute control it once wielded, unaware that the real leverage has already been amputated by a changing global order. Ultimately, the loudest roars often come from the oldest lions, trying to mask the fact that the jungle no longer fears their bite. And while this geopolitical theater plays out, let us pivot our gaze from the grand illusions of international financial warfare to the domestic theater, where a far more cynical wealth transfer is currently unfolding. Next week, starting on April 20th, the administration plans to initiate a massive tariff refund program. The highest court recently struck down specific protectionist tariffs implemented earlier this year, declaring the revenue collection entirely illegal. Consequently, the government is legally mandated to return these funds, a staggering sum amounting to over $160 billion. Than the surface. This forced reimbursement appears to be a triumphant restoration of the rule of law. However, an independent observer must look past the headline and ask who exactly is receiving this massive financial windfall. When the tariffs were originally levied, the financial burden did not fall on foreign geopolitical competitors. Instead, the cost was immediately embedded into the supply chain and passed down to the ordinary consumer. Working-class families effectively paid this illegal tax every time they purchased imported goods, auto parts, and daily necessities at artificially inflated prices. Yet, as the government prepares to return the money, the Treasury is not issuing refund checks to the millions of citizens whose purchasing power was diminished. The capital is being routed directly back to the corporate importers. It is a textbook macroeconomic disaster. A regressive tax acting as a societal wealth vacuum, systematically extracting capital from the bottom of the socioeconomic pyramid and depositing it directly into the vaults of the commercial elite. But the corruption deepens further. Even for an ordinary, mid-sized import business, retrieving these legally owed funds is practically impossible. The administrative labyrinth designed to process these refunds is nothing short of a mathematical absurdity. Official government estimates suggest that calculating, auditing, and clearing the myriad of individual claims will require over 4,431,161 hours of manual bureaucratic labor. When you factor in the standard operational inefficiencies of federal agencies, complete with weekends, federal holidays, and routine administrative delays, ordinary businesses will be waiting an estimated 506 years to see a single dime of their money. If we rewind 506 years from our current year, we land in the early 16th century, an era closer to the dawn of the global spice trade than modern commercial law. This catastrophic inefficiency is not an accident. It is a deliberate friction designed to create a secondary market for political insiders. As we have seen in the shadows of Washington, politically connected elites, specifically networks tied to the Commerce Department, have systematically positioned themselves to purchase the rights to these delayed tariff refunds. Operating much like predatory financial institutions, they offer struggling, cash-starved importers pennies on the dollar for their legitimate claims. Because these elites possess the exclusive political access required to bypass the 5-century waitlist, they can cash out the full value directly from the Treasury at lightning speed. If an independent business refuses to sell its refund rights to these modern aristocrats, they are simply condemned to the bureaucratic abyss. This is not the mechanism of a functioning competitive free market. This is a financial architecture of a late-stage empire in terminal decay. It perfectly mirrors the infamous tax farming systems of the fallen Roman Republic, where connected patricians bought the legal rights to extract wealth from the struggling provinces. Leaving the general populace hollowed out and desperate, the majestic machinery of the state has been completely repurposed into a private extraction engine for crony capitalists. What we are witnessing is the raw law of the jungle, elegantly dressed in a tailored suit, a ruthless, carnivorous system that cannibalizes its own domestic economic base to enrich a heavily protected oligarchy. In this environment, the much-touted dream of equitable prosperity becomes a cruel mirage, accessible only to those who already hold the master keys to the Treasury. The profound tragedy is not merely the theft of billions of dollars, but the irrevocable destruction of the institutional trust that is required to hold a civilization together. Consequently, as the domestic machinery grinds to a halt under the weight of its own avarice, the shockwaves of these erratic policies are violently fracturing Washington's international alliances. The Treasury's whispered proposals to legally reinstate those very same catastrophic tariffs by early July have sent a chilling realization across the Atlantic. During the initial wave of these economic hostilities, traditional European allies pleaded for exemptions, acting with the deferential loyalty expected of the post-Second World War unipolar order. Their reward for such fealty was merely a heavier financial burden. Today, the structural arithmetic has fundamentally changed. During the Cold War, the transatlantic alliance was bound together by mutual existential threats and massive American capital injections. Today, Washington demands that exact same loyalty while actively exporting inflation and industrial sabotage. When you examine the macroeconomic landscape, with the Eurozone's industrial production index consistently contracting, driven largely by inflated energy costs and weaponized trade barriers, it becomes mathematically clear that Europe simply cannot afford to subsidize Washington's geopolitical tantrums any longer. Nowhere is this fracture more stunning than in the United Kingdom, a nation that has spent the better part of a century operating as the loyal geopolitical shadow of the United States. Yet, the current American administration has subjected the British leadership to a relentless, almost theatrical barrage of diplomatic humiliation. This is not merely a clash of personalities. It is a severe structural divergence. The International Monetary Fund recently issued a stark warning, calculating that the United Kingdom stands to absorb the most severe economic devastation among all major industrialized nations as a direct consequence of Washington's proxy economic wars. In response, the British establishment has mobilized its soft power, utilizing its legacy financial media to openly declare the American strategy in the Middle East a catastrophic failure. When the architect's most devoted builder publicly condemns the blueprints, the collapse of the entire structure is imminent. Moving southward to the Mediterranean, the rupture with Italy reveals a profound ideological divorce. The Italian government recently took the unprecedented step of halting the automatic renewal of its bilateral defense pacts with Israel. This was not a bureaucratic oversight. It was a direct response to the reality on the ground in Lebanon, where United Nations peacekeepers, including Italian military personnel, found themselves in the crosshairs of an allied military apparatus that Washington continues to shield from consequence. The Italian public's outrage has been further catalyzed by local media exposing raw, unfiltered footage of the conflict's brutal realities, fundamentally shattering the sanitized narrative previously mandated by the transatlantic consensus. Italy is demonstrating a cold truth of modern statecraft. Ideological loyalty evaporates the exact moment it demands complicity in one's own strategic humiliation. Even in the energy-rich sands of the Middle East, the traditional compliance is vanishing. Saudi Arabia, observing the chaotic American threats to seal off maritime choke points, has reportedly demanded that Washington immediately retract its blockade orders in the Strait of Hormuz. Riyadh understands the brutal calculus of global shipping. If Washington forces a closure in Hormuz, reciprocal actions will instantly paralyze the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, effectively suffocating the global energy supply chain. The historical masters of the region are now recognizing that their American security guarantor has transformed into the primary source of regional instability. The post-war alliance network is no longer a forged steel chain anchoring global stability. It has mutated into a fragile necklace of glass beads, violently shattering under the sheer gravitational pull of Washington's erratic demands. Hegemony does not perish by the sword of a foreign conqueror. It quietly suffocates in the cold vacuum created when its closest friends finally walk away. Yet, to truly understand this fracture, let us pivot our analytical lens from the distancing alliances of Europe back to the geopolitical epicenter that ignited this current crisis. The Middle East. The absolute irony of the present theater is that Washington, the self-proclaimed architect of global security, is currently negotiating not from an unassailable position of strength, but from a desperate need to appease Tehran. Iran has laid its strategic cards face up on the table, establishing a non-negotiable prerequisite for any broader de-escalation in the vital maritime corridors. That prerequisite is a verifiable, comprehensive ceasefire in Lebanon. The mathematics of this demand are terrifying for Western economic planners. The Strait of Hormuz is not merely a waterway, it is the jugular vein of the global energy market. Approximately 21 million barrels of petroleum transit through this narrow choke point every single day, constituting roughly 20% of total global consumption. If Tehran acts on the escalating pressure and enforces a blockade on both Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the ensuing supply shock would instantly paralyze the global supply chain, driving energy prices to catastrophic heights and triggering a synchronized global recession. Faced with this existential economic threat, the American diplomatic apparatus has been unceremoniously transformed into an anxious, frantic mediator. Washington is expending massive political capital, dispatching its highest-level envoys to desperately broker a cessation of hostilities in Lebanon. They are attempting to manufacture a narrative of masterful diplomacy out of what is fundamentally a forced strategic retreat. However, this is precisely where the grand strategy of a superpower collides fatally with the localized survivalist instincts of its own proxy. The primary obstacle obstructing Washington's desperate peace initiative is not the Iranian establishment, but rather its own heavily subsidized ally. The current Israeli leadership. What we are witnessing is perhaps the most devastating modern example of the tail wagging the imperial dog. The Israeli Prime Minister is completely entangled in a complex web of domestic corruption trials, facing an enraged populace and historically grim electoral prospects. His political survival, and potentially his legal immunity, is entirely predicated on maintaining a continuous state of maximum emergency. The moment the guns fall silent and a ceasefire is implemented, the war cabinet dissolves, and the domestic political reckoning immediately begins. Therefore, while the White House practically begs for regional stabilization to secure its global economic lifelines, the Israeli leadership deliberately accelerates the tempo of the conflict, funneling additional mechanized brigades and infantry into the Lebanese theater in direct defiance of Washington's wishes. The superpower finds itself paralyzed, held completely hostage by the desperate, localized calculations of a politician fighting for his own political survival. This dynamic exposes a fatal structural flaw in the architecture of modern American hegemony. By unconditionally tethering its strategic flexibility to a proxy state, whose domestic interests directly contradict American global security requirements, Washington has effectively surrendered its geopolitical autonomy. It is trapped in an impossible paradox. The administration must exert immense pressure on the Israeli leadership to secure the Iranian appeasement necessary to keep global shipping lanes open. Yet, any public, definitive rupture with Israel would instantly ignite a catastrophic political rebellion within the United States Congress, dooming the administration's midterm electoral survival. The American empire is effectively trapped inside a burning room, and the regional proxy holding the only exit key is busy pouring more gasoline on the floorboards. Ultimately, when a purported hegemon subordinates its global macroeconomic survival to the domestic legal evasions of a regional client state, it ceases to be an empire directing the course of history. It becomes merely a captive, chained to a throne it no longer controls. Furthermore, while the administration is hopelessly entangled in the Middle Eastern paradox, the true inferno is blazing directly inside the halls of Washington. The domestic political apparatus has reached a state of near total structural paralysis, rendering rational statecraft virtually impossible. Just days ago, on April 15th, the opposition party initiated a localized, yet highly symbolic, attempt at drafting articles of impeachment. While this specific legislative maneuver did not achieve immediate execution, it sent a violent, unmistakable tremor through the highest levels of government. The political mortality of the current leadership is no longer a theoretical debate reserved for academic circles. It is an active, deafening countdown clock, with the midterm elections looming like an impending execution. The administration is backed into an extraordinary, suffocating corner. The domestic legislative agenda is in ruins. The vaunted tariff refund scheme has been exposed as a grotesque oligarchical grift, and the internal legal battles are mounting exponentially. In classical geopolitical theory, The most dangerous actor on the global stage is not a rising, ambitious challenger, but a declining incumbent who realizes they have nothing left to lose domestically. When the internal pressure cooker reaches its critical, explosive limit, foreign policy ceases to be a disciplined tool for national security. Instead, it rapidly mutates into a desperate, high-stakes gamble for mere political survival. We must, therefore, seriously consider the profound global risks when an isolated leadership is forced to operate under these chaotic conditions. Whispers are already proliferating through intelligence corridors regarding sudden, impulsive troop deployments or catastrophic ground escalations. These potential maneuvers are rarely the product of cold, calculated strategic analysis or the careful weighing of macroeconomic interests. We are no longer dealing with the rational actors of the Cold War era who meticulously measured every naval deployment against the calculus of mutually assured destruction. Rather, these are the chaotic, reactionary spasms of an administration attempting to manufacture a monumental external crisis solely to distract from its own internal collapse. As if the leadership gambles on a massive military escalation and fails to deliver a decisive, widely televised victory, the domestic blowback will instantly transition from a procedural impeachment threat to total political annihilation. The global order is effectively being held hostage by the electoral panic of a single deeply divided capital. The administration is acting as a desperate gambler who, having lost the treasury and the trust of the public, throws the very deed to the empire onto the geopolitical roulette table, praying a single spin will erase a mountain of failures. Ultimately, when the stability of the entire international system relies on the panicked survival instincts of a cornered domestic faction, the world is not experiencing diplomacy. It is merely waiting for the inevitable detonation. Ultimately, we are currently witnessing the agonizing, real-time unraveling of a unipolar illusion. What was once the unquestioned global hegemon has been reduced to turning its financial weapons inward, cannibalizing its own domestic wealth, while the grand geopolitical chessboard is steadily lost to nations, exercising greater patience, structural resilience, and long-term strategy. The era of dictating global terms through the mere threat of economic fury has irrevocably passed, as the dust inevitably settles over this chaotic chapter. The critical question we must ask ourselves is no longer whether the global order will change. That transition is already fully underway. The only remaining question is who will possess the stability and foresight to stand upright in the ruins of the old system. The world is profoundly complex, and navigating these monumental shifts requires a clear, unflinching view of reality. If you found this analysis insightful and want to continue piercing through the geopolitical noise, please remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your own thoughts in the comments below. I am Sophia Bennett, and until next time, keep your eyes on the board.